Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for a bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. And with me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson. How are you doing today, Jay?
I'm doing good, Mike. How are you?
I am doing just fine. Let's start with, I think what almost everyone would say is a stunning foreign policy development. President Trump has agreed to meet with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un for talks by the end of May. The administration quickly made clear that they were not going to reward the North simply for coming to the negotiating table, that sanctions would not be eased in advance of the meeting, and that they would maintain their insistence on North Korean denuclearization as the only acceptable ultimate outcome. So, Jay, what do you make of all this?
Well, I think you're exactly right that this is a big deal. I am looking at this through a foreign policy sort of lens, and this isn't a partisan thing. This is I'm thinking just international. The biggest thing, one of the things that Kim has wanted, the Kim regime has wanted for forever, is this sort of recognition of sitting down with the U.S. president. So on the one hand, I'm concerned from a negotiating standpoint that we have given him, in large part, one of the things he's seeking, and really gotten no concessions on the other side. So that troubles me to some extent. I'm also a little troubled by what I read, and again, this is, of course, I was not there, but all the reports are that this was sort of a Trump making this decision on his own, without much consultation with anyone else, and came as a surprise to many staff members, to the State Department, and so forth. So that also troubles me, that it's sort of this little shoot from the hip response. Now that being said, I can also take the other position and say that perhaps that's what's needed. Perhaps the shoot from the hip, the mano a mano, Trump sitting down, maybe that's a good thing. I mean, if you're, the example I look back to is Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev at Reykjavik, when the sense was that Reagan is in over his head and so forth, and on a private walk, as the story goes, I mean, Reagan and Gorbachev were essentially just about in agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons, and staff people were freaking out.
But let's make a distinction here. I mean, Ronald Reagan, people called him a cowboy.
Donald Trump is not. Yes.
Yeah, Ronald Reagan was a serious person who actually had plenty of previous experience, and so they're shooting from the hip, and then there's Donald Trump.
Yes, no, I think that's a good distinction to make, that Donald Trump is not Ronald Reagan.
No.
But I was just saying, in terms of historical examples, it wouldn't be the first time that a president has sort of gone off on his own on these sort of foreign policy decisions and tried to rely on his own personal charm or a personal relationship, building personal relationship with the other party, and like just as Donald Trump is no Ronald Reagan, Kim Jong-un is no Mikhail Gorbachev, and I think that's the other piece that with Gorbachev, you had a rational actor. I am still really concerned that I just don't think Kim is. The other weird thing about these kind of things is the only real way you can look at this is by looking at other historical examples, which are always imperfect. And the biggest diplomatic historical example that everyone always throws out, because it's the one everyone learns about, is you want to go ahead and name it?
No, you go ahead. I'm not exactly sure where you're going with this.
Oh, I was going to say Chamberlain and Hitler.
It didn't even occur to me.
That every time this is like it's Neville Chamberlain all over again, and that's something else. I think it's not impossible that we have that kind of a situation, that just because of the nature of the person you're dealing with.
See, I don't think
if you go and assume you're dealing with a rational actor or an honest actor, I think that's a mistake.
I don't think that any of these historical parallels or analogies are any use at all, actually. I think that both Kim Jong un and Donald Trump are unique individuals, for better, or mostly and almost entirely for worse, certainly in Kim Jong un's case. And really, it seems to me this is a case of Donald Trump just once again getting in his own way, not being able to resist the big move, the spotlight. I think you can make a reasonable argument. I don't know that I entirely buy it, but I think you can make a reasonable argument that the increased international pressure, the increased sanctions have been possibly working, and that might be exactly why Kim Jong Un has, wanted to start talks. And there is a long-standing, decades-long pattern that we see in North Korea. When they start to feel the pinch, they try to trade the appearance of rationality or bargaining for some sort of easing off. I mean, this has been the Charlie Brown, Lucy in the football thing for decades now.
And it's worked every time.
It's worked every single time. And so I feel like by playing to Donald Trump's vanity, they're playing right into this. There hasn't even been a phone call between the two. This would actually be, Donald Trump would be the first head of state that Kim Jong un has ever met with. This is pretty big, and obviously that's how Donald Trump sees it. But there's a reason why you don't start out with head of state meetings. There's a reason why it starts with lower level talks, and so if North Korea is serious about actually making some progress diplomatically, this is not how you go about it. So I certainly hope for the best, but given what we know about the specific past of North Korea in these cases, the incentives and what's driving Kim Jong un and what drives Donald Trump, I don't have much hope at all for this, actually.
Yeah, and the other, nor do I think in the long run that this is actually going to result in some sort of enforceable bargain that the North Koreans would really honor. But the other piece to look at this is where we stand with our allies on this. Now, there has been a thawing of relations for good or bad between North Korea and South Korea, mostly because of the election of the South Korean president, who is more in favor of let's call it détente with the North than his predecessor. But there's also a concern that this type of diplomacy, without working in consultation with allies, for example, the Japanese, is going to be problematic for the region.
Any other thoughts on that before we move on?
No, that's about. We will wait and see. And I guess the other piece, though, is we'll see if this actually happens and when it actually comes to fruition, because it's easy for Trump to say yes, but there may be many more hoops that Kim will throw up, or that Donald will throw up.
Excellent point.
Scuttle this thing.
You could totally see this being canceled with some a bellicose statement from the North Koreans about how we're being completely unreasonable and that sort of thing. But we will see if it actually comes about. All right, well, this week, the Justice Department brought suit against the state of California, alleging that 3 California laws are in violation of the Constitution's Supremacy Clause. Now, the laws in question prohibit private employers from giving U.S. immigration officials access to documents or workplaces without a court order, create a state inspection system for immigration detention facilities, and limit what state law enforcement officials can communicate concerning certain immigrants who are of interest to federal authorities, as well as putting some restrictions on transferring immigrants to federal custody. Now, in response to this, California argues that under the 10th Amendment, they have the right to make public policy for citizens of the state, and there's no conflict. And they point actually to a Supreme Court precedent, most notably, unusually, a decision written by Justice Scalia in the 1997 case of Prince versus the United States, in which the court held that the federal government couldn't coerce local law enforcement officials into essentially doing part of their job for them. So Jay, it seems like we're living in strange times here. Republicans are talking about federal government supremacy, and liberals are leaning on, the 10th Amendment, states' rights, and Justice Scalia of all people. So,
Well,
what's going on here? I mean, how do you see this playing out?
I think this is a wonderful step by the Justice Department to restore the rule of law. Look, I mean, I'll tell you about another Republican president who believed in federal supremacy, and that was Abraham Lincoln. What in this
Oh
case,
my
this
gosh,
this is
the
not
parallels
this
you're
is not
making here, Jay.
this is not a no, but look, this is not this is not a 10th Amendment case of that the federal government is somehow requiring the states to provide aid and enlist. What this is relieving. You have private citizens in California who could face criminal penalties for complying with federal law, and that's that's a tremendous problem. If someone believes I may have someone working for me who is here illegally, and they don't report that. I mean, they're in. Oh my gosh! It's again, to me, it boggles my mind that California would pass such these three different pieces of legislation. The one that they're probably closest on, that the state has the best argument on, is probably the inspection of the facilities. You can make a better argument that there's less real conflict with federal law there. But the point of the legislation all seems to be to stymie the legitimate enforcement of federal immigration law, and to say that, okay, we're not going to help, we're not going to expend our resources for the federal government. That's one thing, but it's quite another to prohibit local communities or individuals from voluntarily complying with federal law. So I mean, I guess. To me, I think this is going to be a winner for the Trump administration in the long run. They will most likely lose the district court level and perhaps the Ninth Circuit, but the Supreme Court will affirm them. And the other funny thing, that the precedent on which they will affirm will most likely be the Arizona Brewer case in 2012, where the Supreme Court essentially held that, look, immigration is a federal matter, and the president, the executive, has wide authority, and the federal government has wide authority to enforce those, and states cannot create policies in abrogation of the federal law.
Right, and I think you're right that the fundamental question is that to what extent do these California laws actually go against federal law, contravene federal law, and then to what extent actually is the federal government expecting California to do part of its job for it? And it's, given that there are three separate laws here, I could certainly see an outcome in which in one or two of these instances, the court says, well, that actually does sort of fit what we talked about in print, but in other cases, maybe it's closer to Arizona versus United States. So I do agree with you that ultimately, when this gets to the Supreme Court, and I'm sure it will, that a small majority will uphold the Department of Justice. I don't know to what extent, if it'll be.
I think it'll be. I think it'll be a. I mean, I'm going to go way out on a limb here.
Okay.
And say this will be a 7-2
wow.
Supreme Court decision. And again, that'll probably be whatever, 2 years from now or something. But
if it's 2 years from now,
I'm going way out prediction, but even a pretty precise prediction 2 years down the road.
Well, if it's 2 years down the road, I mean, there's recently been talk that this summer that Justice Kennedy is going to be retiring, and so if that's the case, then there would probably be a more conservative justice appointed.
That wouldn't change the outcome, because Kennedy would be in my majority in this situation, maybe, in any event. But
7-2, I think not, but we will see a few years down the road in any case. So one other point that you made is, you talked about the intent of these laws. Now, in previous conversations we've had about judicial decision making, I felt like you've been reluctant to have the judiciary delve into the intent of the legislature. I'm thinking in terms of some
No,
laws.
no, that's fair.
Okay.
And when I said intent, I'm not saying that should be the touchstone of how the
Oh,
judiciary
okay.
reviews it. They ought to review it on what the language says. But I'm saying the political intent of it that would spark the Justice Department to sue, I think is pretty clear.
Gotcha. Okay. All right, before we move on, we'd like to thank our newest supporter, Juliet, who made a generous contribution to the show through PayPal. And so thank you, Juliet. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yep. And of course, when you make a pledge of financial support for this show, we would love to include a message from you. I didn't hear anything from Juliet, but if you're listening, please send us an email. We'd love to, make any statement, manifesto, whatever you have. And that the length of your manifesto might vary. If you give us, $500,000, then we'll pretty much let you just run the show for a week or so. But anyway, you can just do that at mail@politicsguys.com. And of course, now that we're completely ad-free, listener support hugely important for us. And so, if you want to become a supporter, just go to politicsguys.com/support, and you'll see those Patreon, PayPal links there. Thanks so much. All right, moving on. Well, Jay, even though a bunch of prominent Republicans tried so hard to talk him down, President Trump's gone and done it. This week, he made good on his promise made last week.
Including both you and I.
Yep, there you go. To impose that 25% tariff on imported steel and a 10% tariff on imported aluminum, both of which will take effect in 15 days. Now, there is a temporary exemption for Canada and Mexico, which the administration says it will continue or not, depending on the progress that's made on the current NAFTA renegotiation talks. And this, it seems to me, is the clearest indication, if we even needed more indication, that the tariffs have absolutely nothing to do with the ostensible reason of national security and have everything to do with a completely short-sighted attempt to help a small number of Americans who work in steel and aluminum manufacturing by essentially hurting a far, far greater number of Americans, those millions of people who are employed in industries that use steel and aluminum, as well as American consumers. And I think Gary Cohn, President Trump's former top economic advisor, who recently resigned in the wake of this, would probably be one of the people who would agree with me on that, which, in his resignation, of course, leaves almost no free trade voices in the administration, or as I would call them, voices of reason. So, Jay, we talked about this last week when the president made that surprise announcement. What are your thoughts now that he's followed through?
In large part, disappointed that he's followed through. In small part, maybe there's a glimmer of hope in that it still remains to be seen if this is again, the story started, it was going to be this 25%, 10% across the board. And then, well, no, not for our allies. And, well, we'll make other exceptions and so forth. So I think it's a bad way to go. I think there's maybe a glimmer of hope. And the market's sort of picked up on this that, look, how serious is he really in enforcing this? Is this just sort of the Trump bargaining position? The departure of Gary Cohn, I think, is a lot more troubling, because what that signals, perhaps, is that maybe this is not bargaining. And you're right. There seems to be, as a lot of writers have put it, I mean, one less grown up in the room in the administration. Whoever he chooses to replace Gary Cohn, I think that's going to send a pretty clear message as to where he's going, and I'm concerned with the signal it'll send to the markets if he brings in another protectionist like a Wilbur Ross or someone of that ilk.
Yeah, well, I think that's fairly likely. For me, it seems to me once again that Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand actually how international trade works, which is hugely troubling to me. A lot of that deficit that he talks about, that he over-exaggerates with some questionable numbers, is actually invested right back into the United States. So I don't think he doesn't understand this, which is shocking and disturbing, or he understands it and just doesn't care, which is troublesome for a whole other reason. Yeah. I think also he needs a lesson on comparative advantage and what protectionism brings with it. I mean, protected industries we know protected industries tend to be far less innovative and competitive industries. If you take a look, for instance, at the United States steel industry in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was a fairly well protected industry simply because, in the wake of, World War, there wasn't a whole lot of international competition.
There wasn't competition,
right?
yeah.
So the U.S. steel industry was making almost all of its steel through something called the open hearth method. And this is an old method of making steel. And at that point, by the 1950s, they knew this was a very inefficient method, but they didn't have any incentive to change because they didn't have any competition. But then as countries in Europe and in Japan, started investing in far more efficient methods, there's a method called basic oxygen, and electric arc was another method. I mean, quadrupling productivity. The U.S. industry just basically dragged its feet and had to scramble to try to catch up and adopt these methods. And it never really did. It squandered that. It didn't invest in that because this is the sort of thing we see with protectionism again and again and again. So that's one thing I think that people might not realize.
Yeah, and I would agree with you and highlight that this is one of the things that led to what a lot of people now call the Rust Belt, which where you and I grew up. I grew up in a steel town that was essentially destroyed in about the mid 70s when the major mills closed down, and it was sort of a time bomb that was planted back in the 1950s because there wasn't that investment, there wasn't that moving forward, and when new competition eventually arose, there was no way to come close to countering it.
Yep. Yeah, and another point, I think this is maybe even a bigger point, I don't know, is this actually isn't going to hurt China much at all. China doesn't import very much steel into the United States. It's around $1 billion a year. If Donald Trump was serious about cracking down on truly disruptive and bad things, I'd say, that China is doing, he would focus on their intellectual property theft. Now, one estimate of that puts it as high as $600 billion a year. That's, as he would say, huge, right? And I think not only that, but this is something, the intellectual property theft, this is something that hurts other countries too. And this is a place where we could potentially build an international consensus. But the very fact that he's imposing these tariffs makes that much harder. And I think, once again, he's just not thinking in the big picture, not thinking strategically. And once again, we're abandoning our international leadership role to do something that could really matter a lot. And that's hugely disturbing to me.
To paraphrase President Obama, the 1930s are calling and they want their trade policy back.
Absolutely. I mean, and some people would say, well, why, shouldn't we do something about this? And of course, Congress could do something about this. Congress could pass legislation restricting the president's ability to set tariffs. I mean, the only reason he has that authority is because Congress gave it to them. But of course, that would require a veto-proof majority, and not only that, but it would look pretty bad for the party in advance of the midterms. So,
Well, if I'm congressional Republicans, though, I think it's still worth you put the bill out there and let people run on it. Let those people who need to run on it. Push the Democrats to see where they're going to be on that. Push them into the protectionist. I mean, because to me, again, that just comes down to a sort of a core principle of why you were elected as a Republican, and if you're not going to, and again, to me, the way I view the world, and perhaps I'm wrong, but I think most economists would agree, this is going to be bad. Should these tariffs be imposed actually and start working at the levels that President Trump envisions, it's going to be bad for the economy across the board, and it's going to be bad for Republicans because of they're the party in power. It's also going to be bad for Republicans because it's going to mute and this is where you and I would disagree, but it will mute and distort the positive effects that were the hard fought and won in the tax reform bill. So.
Well, and I agree with you that Republicans should do that, but I think our politics has become so degraded that you have the spineless Paul Ryan and equally spineless Mitch McConnell who simply won't do that because they won't put doing the right thing on this, the thing that would be, I think, good for millions, for almost all Americans, ahead of the short-term political calculations. I'm not saying this isn't something on other issues that Democrats wouldn't do, but that's where we're at. Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell know that this is incredibly stupid and reckless and it's going to be greatly harmful, but they're not going to buck the president because that's just not who they are. They don't have they won't be willing to do that. And it's really sad, as the president might say. I think my bet though is the way they're looking at that is that they're saying, well, maybe we can kind of work on him and kind of whittle these things down a little bit. And then in the longer run, there are a number of people, obviously, who are saying, well, by January of 2021, if things go as we hope they'll go, these things can be reversed by a new president. But of course, a lot of damage.
Right, and then the other, I guess, the other perhaps Republican hope is to the extent the effects of the tariffs don't kick in until November. That might be sort of a ray of hope. But to me, that's a big risk. I would rather be the guy out there campaigning against this from day one. So when it does go south, you can say, hey, don't look at me.
Right.
So.
Well, and some people have asked, well, isn't this, because I've made the point a number of times that this is clearly not a national security issue. And even, it's on the face of it, based on what the Trump administration has said and how they're using this. Say, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that violates the WTO agreement. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that the countries who believe it to be a violation can essentially take them to court, as it were.
WTO court, right. Yes.
But of course, that's a process that takes years. And the only remedy that the WTO can impose is saying, well, you can go ahead and impose retaliatory tariffs right. to the amount that you are being affected, essentially. And so there's not really much bite in that. It would take years for it to happen. And so it's not like when you violate federal law. This is a whole different thing. And so because we have the international system we have, it's not like the WTO can do something to these United States industries. All it can say is basically,
nor should they be able to. I think that's a point.
Some people would say, absolutely. So I just wanted to bring that up. So.
Yeah, no, and there's a remedy there, but I think there's going to be the more immediate remedy of retaliatory tactics or retaliatory tariffs, and then you sue with the WTO later.
Yeah.
So
and that's another good point, because a lot of this retaliation is going to hurt other American industries, American farmers who export an awful lot of stuff, and it's the Trump administration doesn't seem to care a whole lot about that. It seems like the idea is, well, if they hit back, we'll hit back even harder. And this is exactly the sort of logic it makes you just want to, faceplant, essentially. Anyway, all right, in what some people are calling a rare defeat for the NRA, this week Florida's state legislature passed new restrictions on firearms ownership. The measure they passed imposes a 3-day waiting period for most long gun purchases, raises the minimum purchase age from 18 to 21, bans the possession and sale of bump stocks, bans possession of firearms for people deemed mentally defective or those who've been committed to a mental institution, and it allocates millions of dollars for school security as well as the training and arming of school employees. And in addition, it includes funds for raising and rebuilding Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, which was, of course, the site of that mass shooting that left 17 people dead. Now, prior to this bipartisan vote in favor of the legislation, the NRA issued what it called an emergency alert, telling its members that this wouldn't prevent similar incidents and asking them to contact their state legislatures to, urge them to reject the measure. And after Governor Rick Scott signed it into law on Friday, the NRA brought suit, arguing that the age change was what they call a blatant violation of the Second Amendment. So, Jay, what do you think about this legislative response, which I should point out is something we haven't seen much more than a glimmer of at the federal level to this point? I mean, do you think it's something that
Well,
other states or even that Congress should be looking at doing?
um, I mean, look, we talked about this on the policy level a couple of weeks ago, and on one level, I think what the NRA is saying is correct. I don't know that these measures are going to really do much to prevent a future incident. The parts of the bill which I think would have the most impact would be sort of the better funding for school security, allowing teachers, other school personnel voluntarily to be armed if they so wish. Which differs from the Trump policy, which was sort of the I'm going to arm all the teachers or something. So I mean, I think those things again are marginally helpful. The age change, again, to me, that doesn't strike me as anything that's really going to move the ball forward. It's again, so many of these shooters acquire their weapons illegally. This is probably one of the few instances where you've got someone who is between that age of 18 and 21 who purchased a firearm. I think there'd be a great argument to say, geez, I'm 18, I'm old enough to go fight for my country, but I can't buy a weapon. So I don't know. Does that violate the Second Amendment? My thoughts are probably not.
Yeah. And in fact, there's some precedent on this. There was a case a few years ago where the NRA actually brought suit against the ATF. It was about a similar law, which there was an age thing from 18 to 21. And while the Supreme Court didn't hear the case, it was heard by a district court and a circuit court, and they actually upheld that age limit. So I don't know that the NRA says everything's a violation of the Second Amendment. So they're
sure, and we should maybe take this opportunity to say that. Well, also, I got off my train of thought. The bump stock thing, again, I think that's something probably everyone can agree on. So, look, I think Florida did something, and I suppose that's worth doing. With Congress, I think perhaps they should consider these things, although you're often one of these people who says Congress shouldn't rush into anything, and we need to wait for all the data, and we need more study in regular order, and but
well, yeah, and I wasn't asking you that to say that I think this should be done right away. Well, I guess what I actually think is there's a good case to be made for doing this at the state level, in part because it's so difficult to get any sort of movement on the federal level. And of course, Florida is a Republican legislature. This is not a deep red state by any means, but I think that advocates of stricter gun regulation probably are going to have more success working in the state by state level. Now, of course, there are some states where that's just not going to happen. Obviously, Texas and a lot of other deep red states. But I think that's oftentimes the way forward. And you make a good point. And I think the NRA makes a reasonable point to the extent that saying that this is only going to be effective at the margins. But of course, that's the only sort of legislation that has even a shadow of a chance of passing. Now, in this specific case, of course, the fact that the shooter was under 21 and had mental health issues, this does seem to more directly address that. And so, on that issue, I think the NRA is wrong. But in the larger sense, the gun violence issue that we have is not really a school shooting issue. It's a gun crime issue more broadly. It's a gun suicide issue. It's that sort of thing. I mean, that's where we see the greatest national damage done by.
Well, and those are all different, but those are all different problems.
They sure are,
and they all sort of require different solutions.
But what we know about how getting legislative change enacted happens is there needs to be a triggering event. And there's never going to be a triggering event for just the sort of random gun violence that happens every single day in America. There's never going to be a triggering event for gun suicides, that sort of thing. That's just not going to happen. And so if you care deeply about these things, as I think many people do and should do, then you try to utilize triggering events to help to enact positive change. And some people will say, well, that just seems sneaky and so forth. And, that whole never let a good crisis go to waste. But that's what you have to do to enact what you believe to be positive change. And that's just how it works.
No, I mean, I'll differ with you a little bit, because I think people can take these long-term crises or crises, I don't know, problems, and say, a leader can bring light to that.
I don't think so.
Someone can campaign on that and point out, here's all the issues we've got. Here's what we can do to solve them. For example, I'm thinking of the gun suicide issue, which to me is really separate and apart from, say, gun violence in our inner cities. Those are really two distinct problems with distinct causes and distinct responses. But back to the Second Amendment really quickly. I mean, I just wanted to make the point that so often there is this idea that it's the Second Amendment that stands in the way of any sort of gun regulation, and that's really not the case.
Right, good point.
The Second Amendment jurisprudence, it really doesn't impact most of the things that we're talking about. The time the Second Amendment has been invoked and relied upon to strike down laws, it's been in these sort of complete ban type situations, in the Chicago and Washington, where there was a ban on handgun ownership. It's those types of situations where you say, yes, the Second Amendment, allows you the right to bear arms, and then Heller, they clarify that it's an individual right. But there's really have not been any Second Amendment cases that have spoken to banning particular types of firearms or particular people from getting them. So I don't see that as it's a public policy, political question, not a legal question.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And certainly, we know that certain types of firearms can be banned, at least for public usage. You can't go out and buy a machine gun and that sort of thing.
Right. And that's been on the books since the 1920s.
Yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, and but I guess where I fundamentally disagree with you, maybe you have more faith in the people or in our leaders than I do. I don't know. Usually you're the cynical Machiavellian one, and I'm the more idealistic one. But in this case, I think we've done a little bit of a role reversal, because I just simply don't see any evidence that you can build enough of a strong coalition behind these sort of long-term, hugely important issues that aren't dramatic in some way. I hope you're right, certainly, but I just think you're dead wrong on this, sadly.
All right. Well, I'll try to come up with other examples in the future of places where it's hasn't been exploiting a tragedy, but we've still gotten something accomplished.
That would be great. I would definitely like to see that. I would
I'll think on
hope.
That for next week.
Yes. Give me reason for hope, Jay, please. All right, so it's time for What We're Reading, where we talk about some of the more in-depth, thoughtful things that we're reading, listening to sometimes, or even watching. Jay, what do you got for us this week?
This week I've got, it was sort of a toss-up. I don't know anything that's like really super deep, I guess. But Jonah Goldberg had a piece in USA Today, and then he had sort of a follow-up in his G-File column about youth politics, and it sort of ties into what we were just talking about, and the proposed high school walkouts later this week. And I think he makes some absolutely excellent points, and I believe the children are our future, but there's something to be said about handing over public policy debates to emotional teenagers, and he was sort of broadly lambasted for saying that same thing, and I expect I will be too. But I know some emotional teenagers, and again they may be very bright, their hearts may be in the right place. But they are not the people you want making decisions, and not everything that comes out of their mouths is really a source of clear-eyed wisdom of seeing the world through different eyes. Sometimes, kids don't know what they don't know. And I can tell, I mean, you and I can both test, because we've known each other long enough, that we both were pretty confident that we knew most everything when we were in our early 20s.
Me especially. I have to
yeah.
say. Yeah. No, I think, that's a good point. And again, I'm going to come off sounding more Machiavellian here, again, in a weird turnaround. But certainly people are using these kids as a symbol, as a way to get things done. And there are a couple ways to look at this. And certainly we heard from the right after all this, happened and the kids started organizing, especially in Florida, there at the school, that this was awful, that kids were being used. But using symbols to advance an agenda is not necessarily this awful bad thing. It really depends on what your agenda is. Powerful symbols is how the use of powerful symbols. That's how you get people interested. That's how you get people involved. That's how you get things done in many cases. And so I don't have a problem with people doing that. I have a problem with people doing it for what I would consider nefarious ends.
Right. So you're okay with essentially nefarious tactics as long as the ends justify the means.
Well, I don't see it as being nefarious depending on how you're doing. Now, obviously, there are ways where you can use people that can certainly not be above board, but simply highlighting, what students are doing, if it fits in with your agenda and you're not in any way kind of manipulating them. I think I don't see anything wrong with that.
So, well, okay.
But anyway, Jonah Goldberg
I was a real like hanging curve over the plate there, and I didn't take it.
Oh, you should have.
But so what are you reading?
Well, this week something that I'm recommending is an article by Farhad Manjoo from the New York Times. Actually, he's written on technology for years and years now. In fact, he wrote a book it must have been back in the early 2000s, I think, called True Enough. That was sort of the inspiration for me to write my own book. It's a great book. But anyway, so he did an experiment where for 2 months he got all of his news from print newspapers, and he wrote about what he learned. It was fascinating, and it really fits into a lot of the stuff that I think both you and I believe. He kind of boiled it down into 3 key takeaways, sort of riffing off of Michael Pollan, who writes about food and has some basic rules about how to eat well. So his 3 rules were get news as opposed to opinion, not too quickly, and avoid social media. And I think these are all great points. And his fundamental point is it takes time to understand and process things, how they fit into the greater context. And if you're relying on instant opinion and instant news, you're just getting bombarded with all of this stuff, and it can feel overwhelming and confusing, and it's just a big, big mess. And one point he makes is that, okay, it's not very convenient to get news from actual physical dead tree newspapers, but you can replicate this very easily for yourself. Like, in fact, I do something very much like that. My primary source of news, I recently switched from the New York Times to the Washington Post, and I don't look for the regular breaking updates. I have all that stuff turned off on my phone. I look at the daily print edition, and that's pretty much my touchstone. I'll read, I'll look at some other stuff based on what some of those stories are, but that helps me sort of make the news comprehensible. It gives me sort of a broader context. And he writes a lot about how you can do this in your own life. And I think it's incredibly valuable. And I would absolutely encourage people to read the article and think about, implementing some of the things that he talks about, because I think there are definitely some wise suggestions.
That sounds good.
Yeah. All right. Before we have a little bit of time, I wanted to mention before we end the show today that a number of people, actually a large number of people, participated in our Politics Guys listener survey a while ago, and we want to thank you very much. And we didn't want you to think that we just would sort of, just do this survey and ignore what you had to say. And so I wanted to take a few minutes and just mention some of the things that you wanted to see more of or less of, actually. And Jay and I, we can comment on that. That's okay, Jay?
Sure.
So the biggest...
I'm happy to say that most people are still okay with my right to exist.
Most of them, yeah. There are some. But most people said they want more of nothing. and less of nothing. So we're mostly doing, you like what we're doing, and that's good to hear. But there were a couple of things. People would like to get more guests, more interviews, and we can certainly do that. And I've been working on that. Actually, have some really great interviews coming up in the next few weeks. People mentioned that they wanted more debate, for us to argue our positions more fully. And I guess sometimes when we have 3 or 4 stories, that can be an issue. And they also mentioned that a number of you also mentioned they folks, if you're listening, would be interested in hearing more single topic shows. That's something that we did a few times. We sort of got away from that. And in part, I blame myself here. I recently came back to teaching a full 4-course schedule and revising some of my courses, and it has just totally kicked my butt. And I haven't had the time for that I usually have, but I'm hoping after this semester ends for me in May that we'll be able to maybe do a few more things. Both Jay, between with you and I doing that, and also maybe some shows, single issue shows with me, and I'm doing them maybe with Trey or with Ken or some other folks. So we'll try to do more of that.
I blame you as well.
Yeah, thank you. There are a few things that people wanted to hear less of. Some people mentioned audio quality as sometimes being an issue, and that was, in fact, a big issue for us for a while there. Jay, you'll remember we had all kinds of problems with Skype and cutouts and so forth, but I believe that
my computer sucked.
And now it no longer does. Thanks, in fact, in part to listeners donating and supporting the show, we were able to get Jay a new computer, and it's made a huge difference. Now, some of the audio quality issues.
It's not that fancy.
No, we pretty much we're not just throwing
frugal.
around money on supercomputers or anything like that here. But some of the audio quality issues have to do with guests calling in on not so great connections, and there's sort of a connection here in the issue of when we have really high profile guests, if they're willing to talk to me by, with a tin can at the end of a string, I'm happy, to some huge, names, people I consider huge names. And so I can't necessarily say to guests, well, can you record this on your end and send it over? Because they're not necessarily willing to do that. I try to do what I can with that, but sometimes people are calling on less than great connections, but we're constantly working on that issue. I wanted to let you know. Some other folks mentioned they would like to hear more ideological balance. And I think, it's true. I found it difficult in terms of guests to get a lot of conservative guests. It is not for lack of trying, folks. I have emailed so many people at the American Enterprise Institute, at National Review, at a lot of conservative places. Maybe they're just
too busy working, Mike.
Well, maybe they're gun shy. Maybe they're just skeptical of what we're doing. But it has been so much easier for me to get responses from people left of center than right. And I do not know why. I won't engage in any serious idle theorizing, but I'm constantly trying to get conservative voices on the show. It's just been a real struggle. And maybe it's because I opened my pitch with, I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University, and they just shut down thinking, oh, there's some liberal enclave. But believe me, Northern Kentucky is not a liberal enclave, So anyway, I'll keep on trying to do that. One other thing that people have mentioned they'd like to hear is a female voice, as well as a host to the left of me. There was kind of a tie in that in terms of number of responses. And I'm happy to say we're working on that. I'm talking to a couple of people, and I think we might be able to make that happen starting sometime in April. So stay tuned for that. So there you go. That's what you, the people, had to say.
The people have spoken,
and we are listening, and we're trying to implement that because it's all about giving you the kind of show that you want to hear, and it's a constant effort. And so there you go. And if you have any thoughts, comments on that, or if you just have any thoughts, comments in general, you know how to reach us. It's mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We always have something going on there, some great conversations. You can also message us there. And we're on Twitter as well, @politicsguys. And of course, if you want to support the show, we would greatly appreciate that. That's politicsguys.support, and you'll have those Patreon or PayPal options. That is hugely helpful to us. The executive producers, the Politics Guys, me, Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.